Friends, how lovely to have you join us again after our little summer break. James, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Ian. I hope you've had a good summer.
I have. We haven't been away or anything because we've sort of went away earlier and we're going away again later. But you've had a bit of a nice break, haven't you?
Yes, we have, very much so. Yeah, had a nice time in Cornwall and nice time at New Wine. So
yeah. Oh, good. Well done. So a bit of spiritual, bit of relaxation, and a bit of culture.
A bit of culture, yeah. A bit of culture. Lots of reading. Yeah.
Is reading relaxation for those who read a lot anyway? I don't know.
It depends what you read, really.
Yeah,
I read a couple of novels. That's definitely relaxation.
Very good. Good. Yeah. Well, James, we need to get back in line, don't we, with the lectionary? So
we do.
Where have we got to? We've been adrift for the last few weeks, and forgotten all about the lectionary. And
we have, haven't we? Well, we're on Matthew 16, 21 to 28.
We are, and why are we there?
That is because we are on the 13th Sunday after Trinity.
We are 2013. Great.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And as we find always with these passages, not a very long passage, sort of medium-length passage, but packed full of issues.
Oh yeah, yeah,
it really is. Now, I think one of the things that's really interesting about this passage is the way it fits with the passage immediately preceding, which we didn't talk about because we didn't do a video then.
No.
But on my blog, there's been a bit of a interesting debate around the status of Peter.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, is Peter who some people in the church make him out to be, or is the issue something else?
Yeah, he is.
What is the authority of Peter is the question.
Well, it is, because interesting, on the blog we've got a whole range of views. Some of which are more at the sort of Roman Catholic end of things, and some of which are,
sure.
And so one of the commentators has been insisting that the passage from last week, you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church, and the keys of the kingdom and all that. So notwithstanding the explanation I gave in the blog, so some people say, well, this clearly sets Peter apart from the others, sets him in unique relationship to the ecclesia, and a unique authority in that the keys are given to him. Now, I'm not convinced that that's what the passage means, but of course, what is really interesting is that all those things appear to be undone in this passage. But I mean, you've had some thoughts about that previous passage, haven't you?
Well, yeah. I mean, I remember. I think I read Tom Wright years ago, who sort of undermines the whole sort of Peter focus of that, and basically, you are Peter, and on this rock. Well, what is the this of this rock? Is it Peter, or is it actually the revelation that Peter's received, and therefore the faith of the church? So that's and he takes. I think he takes a. I can't remember where it is he wrote this, but he takes it as the revelation and the faith of the church. So, and of course, the problem with it being Peter is that Peter immediately undermines his credentials in this passage, doesn't he? And that's a massive problem when you think about it, for that take. So, yeah.
In the previous passage, he looks very special and distinctive, and in this passage, he looks very ordinary.
Well, a little bit less than ordinary, perhaps. Yeah, exactly. Quite.
And again, I think there's two issues as well. One is that the weight of tradition of interpretation and the meaning of words. So I just try and avoid using the word church in these contexts because of course, in the context of the gospel, the ecclesia is both, in Greek terms, the group of citizens who meet in the polis to make decisions about how the polis is run, the city is run. But on the other hand, in the Old Testament, it's the ecclesia, the congregation of the sons of Israel. So this is really a word about community, not about institution.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, let's turn to our passage, and there's some just really interesting things in the beginning here, I think, to explore. So first of all is the phrase "from that time." Now that's really interesting, isn't it? Because it's a kind of, in Matthew, it functions as a really decisive marker. The previous time we heard this was after John was put in prison, and so from that time, Jesus then preaches the kingdom.
Yes, it's a phrase that seems to come after something has been triggered, doesn't it? So the imprisonment of John is a trigger. It's an indication of something that's happening, that almost tells Jesus that the time has now come to move on in the ministry. So it's quite a sort of little trigger thing, I think. Yeah.
And I think what's really fascinating here, now there's not much hint in the passage, but it's just the word Jerusalem. And again, we've explored this before, but the fact that in the synoptic gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you do have this north-south divide. We talk about north-south divide in exam results we've just seen, actually, funny enough. But there's a north-south divide in the other way in the Synoptic Gospels, which is in the north, it's actually mostly good stuff, and the crowds follow Jesus, and all sorts of things happening. And of course, in the south, around Jerusalem and Judea, that's when Jesus faces opposition.
Yeah. Yes, it's all conflict with the leaders of the nation and the priests and so on. Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm just contrary to the view where we say the Synoptics historical and John is the spiritual gospel. It seems to me that is entirely a fictive construction.
Yeah.
and I think the Synoptic authors are doing something theological here, and they're saying, look, the world is divided into two parts. There's the adulation, lots of miracles in the crowds, and isn't he wonderful part, but there's also the, no, we don't like what he's doing, he's upsetting us, and he's going to get into trouble part. And it seemed to me that the Synoptics are doing this through a geographical metaphor.
Yes.
Whereas John does it, the fourth gospel does it through his double meaning of words. So it seems to me
he does it linguistically, really, doesn't he?
He does, he does. He does it in terms of language rather than geography, and his geography is much more realistic.
Yeah.
So I think I'd always go back to the word world, cosmos, in the fourth gospel, where the cosmos is that thing which God made and which, you know, through Jesus, nothing was made that was not made through him. And the cosmos is a thing that he loves.
Yes.
John 3:16. But the cosmos is a thing which is opposed to Jesus and the disciples. In this world, John 16:33, in this world, in this cosmos, you will have trouble.
Yeah.
But I've overcome the world. So
yeah.
So it seems to me that there's the same theology, but again being done in a very different way, through a geographical metaphor, spatial metaphor in the Synoptics, and through, as you say,
and I think the Synoptics, in the sense that it feels more subtle in the Synoptics, which is perhaps why we're not so aware of it, because it's put there in the geographical terms, whereas doing it through language, which is what John does, is kind of much more in your face, in the sense you can't avoid it. It's like reading it's like reading Narnia and suddenly noticing the recurrence of a certain idea, which a lot like water in the silver chair or something. It constantly shows up, and you can't avoid the word world, can you? In John's gospel, it's constantly there in front of you, saying, "Well, what does it mean? What does it mean? What
Whereas the tension is obvious. The
tension is obvious. Yeah. Whereas this subtlety in the Synoptics is something we need to be much more aware of, I think. Yeah.
So we've got this change of direction. He's heading south, heading into trouble. And just again, really interesting, isn't it? Well, a couple of interesting things about that. First of all, in the Markan parallel, it says, and Luke says, he taught, or he spoke to his disciples, but Matthew says he showed his disciples. I don't know if there's any significance to that change in vocabulary.
Well, it does feel like it, doesn't it? Because I think on the blog you mentioned this word "show" is a word used of a revelation of something that's new, and it's used in the book of Revelation itself, isn't it? And
it is,
and it feels like and it also, I think the other thing it does is it feels as though it's not a single occasion. I mean, if Jesus is showing through word and action what he means about this, then that is multiple occasions around this time, because it does say from that time on he began to do this. So you kind of get, this is not Jesus sort of sitting down, right, I'm going to teach you about my suffering and death. It's something that becomes very apparent to them all over a period, whatever that period is. So it's quite a different feel to it.
I really like that idea, which I hadn't thought of, that it's this extended thing, because actually that is what happens now in the rest of the gospel, because there are two other occasions where he says this explicitly. But what's fascinating is the way that this negative bit, this challenging part of ministry, is woven in with the contrast of the glory, because well, I mean, we actually looked at it earlier in August, the Transfiguration, which actually follows immediately. It would be useful, wouldn't it, if we actually followed the lectionary in order? But but immediately following this thing about taking up your cross, which we're going to have a look at, then Jesus is transfigured, and so you've got this juxtaposition of suffering and glory all the way through.
And that, I mean, as a disciple, that feels very true to life, doesn't it?
Well, I suppose so, yes. I'm not sure I've ever seen you transfigured, James, but I'm sure you are.
I wasn't thinking quite those terms there.
No, okay. Yes, suffering and glory. Okay.
Yeah.
There's another tension there as well, which is really fascinating, which is on the one hand, Jesus is very specific about which human agents are going to do this to him: the elders, the chief priest, and the scribe. Where we get this cluster of these three groups of leadership, which are overlapping, actually. On the other hand, there's this divine passive, isn't there? He must go, and he must suffer, and he must be killed. and on the third day be raised. So of
Raised,
course,
yes. So
every time you see this repeated passive, you know who the agent is.
yeah, it feels very much as though, yeah, this is a divine necessity. It's not simply the consequence of what these three groups of people in Jerusalem are going to do to him. And I suppose in a sense it feels a little bit like the equivalent of in John, where you have this very strong sense that Jesus is in control, in command of what he's doing. This comes through in a slightly less Jesus focused way, but because it's something, but it's very much it's divine necessity is perhaps good phrase for it.
But it is, and again, you get a different register in the fourth gospel, don't you, where Jesus explicitly says, no one takes my life from me, I give it up. So again, you've got that tension between the fact that Jesus is completely in control on the one hand and completely obedient to the Father, and yet it's through these human agents that all this happens.
So this is beyond human agency. It's beyond simply being a consequence of Jesus' ministry. It is the divine purpose.
No linguistic connection, I don't think, but it does just theologically remind me of the Joseph story, of course, which is that you get all these human agents and agencies and decisions happening, and then at the very end, Joseph says God intended it for good. So the mystery of God's intention and God's providence working out through what looks like human decision.
Yeah, absolutely. Good, interesting parallel.
Do you think people, one or two people I talk to, get a bit tied up about this language of the third day? Because the parallel Mark says after 3 days.
3 days.
Well, it wasn't after 3 days, was it? Because it was Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
So
I don't know whether it's just we need to recognize there's a cultural issue there about inclusive counting. So when you say after 3 days, you're actually counting the day it first happened as the first day. So Friday is the first day, Saturday is the second day, Sunday is the third day. I don't know. Is that?
I suspect we do. I mean, that is well known, isn't it, of Jewish counting?
I think so.
Well,
not just Jewish. I think in lots of other cultures.
In lots of other cultures, no, absolutely. I mean, mathematics has actually changed and developed. Where we count has changed. Surprisingly.
No, this is really interesting. So we've done one verse, great. But Peter takes him aside and begins to rebuke him, isn't it? That is really fascinating. And he uses quite an idiomatic saying here. I mean, the English translation I've got, I'm looking at, far be it from you, Lord. He actually says, mercy to you.
Yes.
Which actually, again, you sometimes hear people say that, don't you? Oh, mercy, they say. Mercy.
Mercy. Yeah. It's still around in English, isn't it?
So this is the how are the mighty fallen? This is, Peter exalted, having the revelation from God, the rock. So now suddenly he is, as Jesus says. Now again, really interesting. Get behind me, Satan, the tempter. Because you're setting your mind not on the things of God, but the things of humanity. It sounds better, doesn't it? Saying not the things of God, but the things of man. But it's not a male man; it's anthropoi. It's human concerns. So But that is extraordinary, isn't it? What an extraordinary shift.
It is in the language. I think. I mean, often when I've spoken to people about this passage, I mean, people say, "Did Jesus really call Peter Satan?" Is that really the kind of language he uses? Surely he should be more polite than that. Whereas actually, in Matthew, I mean, the word Satan, I think, is only used 3 times. I think it's around the temptation of Jesus.
Yes.
And clearly that's the one that's in mind here, in the sense that this is a temptation like the temptation in the wilderness. It's a temptation to the wrongful use of power, which of course is one of the
and pulling him off, deviating from the path that God's called him to say, well, you can achieve that, but you can achieve it this other way, which isn't quite so costly.
So it feels like Jesus is recognizing the sort of echo of that time in the wilderness, and it's almost as if the devil's speaking through Peter to try and have another go to see if he really is resolved, and that's why it gets a sharp rebuke.
Do you think, I mean, just going a bit psychological here, do you think that part of the reason for the sharp rebuke then is that Jesus really feels the cost of this, and he feels the reality of saying, well, it shouldn't be like this. There must be a better way, another way to avoid it.
To me personally, with my own psychological makeup, it does. Actually, I think being able to, I think feeling that temptation and then articulating the alternative. The actual articulation is really important in coming against the internal temptation, if you see what I mean. So, and I think that's why the language is so harsh.
Yeah.
It's almost as if it's almost as if Peter's trying to back Jesus into a corner,
Yeah.
And Jesus needs to get out quickly, if I can put it like that.
And interesting that Peter's
yeah.
obviously having in private, because Peter's taken Jesus aside. So,
Yeah.
and then the scene changes where he then goes back and
Yeah.
makes a public declaration.
Yeah.
There's another little fascinating use of language here, where again a lot of English translations say you are one English translation says you're a hindrance to me, but actually TNIV says you are a stumbling block to me. So it's this word scandalon.
And yeah.
Now I think that's really fascinating for two reasons. One is, on the one hand, we've just had Peter, you are a rock, a Petros.
Yeah.
So that's a rock on which you build. On the other hand, you are a stumbling block. So it's another kind of stone image metaphor. And what I thought was really fascinating is that actually in 1 Peter, assuming you think Peter wrote 1 Peter, in Peter's letter, he actually includes those two terms.
He does, yeah.
Very close to each other, 1 Peter 2. So he talks about Jesus as a stumbling block to some, but he is the cornerstone on which we are being built into a living temple.
And it seems perfectly reasonable, doesn't it, that Peter, whose name means rock, would
be a good rock or a bad rock.
Yeah, and that must have been a question he'd asked himself after this encounter and the previous one. Yeah. Perhaps through his life, am I being in this situation? Am I being a stumbling block, or am I being building on the solid foundation of Jesus? So fascinating, yeah,
it is, isn't it? So, Now, when we get to the second half of the passage here, we've got another sort of turning point. And again, this is really interesting dynamic between Mark's account and Matthew's account for a couple of reasons. So, Matthew 16:24. Then Jesus told his disciples. Now. You can see there's a bit of a move from Peter taking Jesus aside and then Jesus saying, hey, I want to talk to everybody about this. But Mark makes it even more public. In Mark's version, he says, then Jesus called the crowds with his disciples.
Yeah.
And I mean, your observation here is that actually fits the language, doesn't it? The language of if anyone would come after me. It actually looks like it's more directed to the crowds.
It does, because obviously the disciples are already following him. So it makes more sense that he's speaking to those who are undecided, in a sense, counting the cost. Well, absolutely counting the cost. So it feels it makes more sense in the wider context, and therefore, these disciples are perhaps not it's not identical with the group that were mentioned in 21, which seems to be more focused on the 12.
Yeah, and the different gospels do use the word disciple in different ways, don't they?
Absolutely, yeah.
I think. Well, friends, you ought to comment on below, because we haven't. I'm doing this dangerous thing of ad-libbing again, which is really
oh no.
Just on the top of my head, my thought is that the word disciple in Mark is usually used of the 12, whereas I think the word disciple in Luke is used more broadly. So maybe Matthew is sort of sitting between them.
I think we have observed that before. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if we're both right, then that's great. If we're wrong,
but somebody will tell us if we're wrong.
Make a comment in the
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
we might look it up afterwards and make a comment ourselves.
Yeah.
That'd be a first, wouldn't it? So
now
this is another sort of big area of discussion. This phrase, deny themselves, take up their cross and follow me. Now, this is really fascinating for several reasons. One is that a friend of mine, James McGrath, who's a New Testament scholar, he makes a really interesting observation about this. Oh, by the way, sorry, just jumping back. Yes, if this is about discipleship, that helps us to understand Jesus' rebuke to Peter, which says, get behind me, Satan. Again, most often people think that means get out of my way.
Yeah.
Whereas actually the language hopisomi means fall into line behind me, be a disciple, make sure, get back, remember your station.
Yeah. I'm and that yes, it's absolutely, and because it's repeated here in both halves of the it seems very much that's the way we should take it.
Get behind me. So my friend James McGrath says this: taking up one's cross certainly does not seem to be an already existing expression, nor is such a saying likely to have existed in that period. It seems as though it was only the reality of crucifixion could inspire such an idiom. Now, he's then being skeptical and saying Jesus could not have said this because it's not a pre-existing phrase and it's such an odd thing to say. Now, and therefore it must be a post-crucifixion projection back on Jesus of the early church afterwards. Now, I think there's something really interesting there, which he's drawing attention to. What an odd phrase this is. So he says, for instance, we would never say to somebody, unless you're prepared to be beheaded, you can't follow me. Or unless you're going to sit in the electric chair, you can't follow me. Or unless you're ready for a lethal injection, you can't follow me. And I think what that's really helpfully doing is saying that this is a really odd phrase, isn't it? A really weird expression.
Yeah, it is a really weird expression. But of course, the whole point, and one of the things we often observe about Jesus, is his extraordinary originality with language and with the stories and the metaphors and the pictures that he uses to illustrate what discipleship is about. Of course, yes. I mean, as we often observe, they're drawn from the world of agriculture very often around him. Well, yeah. But we know also that the Romans crucified Jews in Palestine. So
yeah, we do.
He's once again drawing on something that people knew about, and he's drawing in extraordinary, powerful language on the worst thing that people knew about, which was crucifixion. And it seems, and if you're rebuking Peter for what he's just said, then the language needs to be strong, doesn't it, to counter in the minds of the disciples as well as Peter and the wider crowd perhaps as well, those subtle kind of views of who Jesus is and how he's going about his task. He needs to hit them hard, really, between the eyes on this.
And we need to again also recognize that, against the common phrase we use, oh, he's so-and-so's taking up their cross, or they're carrying their cross, whatever. This isn't about having some sort of burden in life. This is about, if in first century Israel you saw someone carrying a cross, they weren't just carrying a burden, they were going to their death, and you knew that.
Yeah.
It is about giving ourselves up.
Yeah.
Oh, again, we might change the register into a Pauline one, where when we're baptized into his death. So we die to self. Yeah. And we start to live a new life. So it is about radical change of direction. It is about giving ourselves up. And of course, then Jesus goes straight on to talk exactly about that. Whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever will lose his life will forsake it. And giving up, what happens if you gain the whole world but lose your life? Again, a little bit of sort of history of interpretation here bearing down on us, which is about the language of soul. So people think that the soul is a sort of one part of three. We have a body, soul, and a spirit, but actually that's not how the word psyche is actually used.
No,
it means your life. The whole of you.
Yeah. And I think the other thing about this language here, Ian, is that it's strong language, clearly, but in the next couple of chapters, Jesus goes on to undermine the disciples' ways of seeing things in order that they begin to see things in the way of the kingdom of God. Yes. And he uses similarly powerful metaphors. I mean, the next one, I think, which comes up in chapter 19, is about riches. And we have the whole camel through the eye of the needle thing, which is a very stark, whatever the history of it may be, and a lot of what we think is speculative. It is
camels can't go through needles.
It's a really powerful metaphor, isn't it? It drags you up straight away. So this is the beginning of there's another huge issue about status, which comes up in chapter 20. Once again, Jesus has to use really quite strong language.
Unless ye be converted,
and
become like little children. That's the word where the word conversion comes from that verb.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. So it's actually consistent with the other situations where Jesus feels a particularly strong need to, as I say, re-educate the disciples, I suppose. Yeah.
Now, the details of the text aside, there's some quite difficult practical pastoral issues around that. Are there not? I mean, it's interesting that again, this is not included in Mark's parallel. This is distinctive to Matthew. For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels, which is exactly reproduced in Matthew 25:31. It's the sheep and the goats thing. Same language there. And he will repay each person according to what he's done.
Yeah.
Now, that's a bit of a challenge, because we all say, well, as long as I trust in Jesus, God looks at me and sees Jesus, and therefore it doesn't matter what my life is like. But Jesus is here calling for a really radical reorientation, which is evident in the way we live our lives, in what we do. So I suppose, for me, a couple of pastoral questions is, well, what do we do if our lives don't look that radically different, on the one hand? On the other hand, I think there's a real danger in this, in that you can preach glibly on this and say, well, you've got to completely change, and make it sound easy when it isn't easy.
No,
I don't know how you respond to those sort of pastoral challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I think increasingly, I mean, I think it's a particular challenge for the church in the West, actually, isn't it? Where, you know, our Christianity has looked really rather similar to our culture for many years, and of course that's fading now, which is why I suspect we're having this conversation about this question much more. But if you say, you know, if we talk a lot about identity today, if we say we are this, that, or the other, then clearly there has to be some evidence that we are this, that, or the other. It's no good me saying I'm a fantastic runner if I never run, you know. And actually, the fact is, I can't run. I'm completely hopeless. So there's no point in me saying I'm a great runner, because everybody knows that's not true. So there's this question about the evidence of our actions, and I think Jesus is talking really, isn't he, here about the evidence of our discipleship. Do we actually look like disciples, his disciples, his followers?
Well, it was Gandhi who said, "I would become a Christian if I ever saw one."
Yeah, exactly. He was really impressed by the Christian gospel. He just didn't see it lived out in the life of the Christians he knew.
Now, we ought to make sure we read this in context of a couple of things. So one is just going back to the first half of the passage, where you see both human agency and divine imperative intertwined here. Now, it seems to me that in this part of the passage, Jesus is asking the challenging question about human decision making, but of course we need to add into that the divine imperative, which is that actually we change because we receive the gift of the Spirit, because we receive new life. So as Paul says to the Philippians 2, God is at work in you to will and to work that which is pleasing in his sight. So it isn't about trying harder.
It's not about trying harder,
but it is about being ready to live differently. I think the other observation I'd make in terms of reading this with other passages is that we've just a couple of chapters earlier in the kingdom parables, that the change comes because the pearl merchant and the man in the field find this incredible treasure, which is the kingdom, and are so overjoyed that they give everything up. And it's interesting, it's the similar language here, isn't it? It's about giving up, giving everything up, giving up. You know, you can't gain the world, and you know, so we need to put this message about difficult decision making consequences alongside both divine agency on the one hand, but also the joy of kingdom life on the other.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely.
And I suppose the other contrast, again, we've anticipated this, is the transfiguration. So we get the last verse of our passage. Amen, I say to you. It's an amen saying, it's a serious saying. There are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now, James, what's he talking about? The coming in his kingdom?
Yeah,
is this the parousia? Is this the end of the world?
Well, the word parousia doesn't turn up in this saying at all. This is, I think, an allusion to Daniel 7, and so once again, as we've mentioned before, we have to remember that the direction of travel is important, and the direction of travel here is Jesus coming to the Father. So it's not from heaven to earth; it's from earth to heaven.
So the coming in his kingdom is his exaltation at the right hand of the Father, the ascension. And we get a foretaste, an anticipation of that in the transfiguration.
Absolutely. And I think that fits, doesn't it, with some standing here will not taste. And in a sense, the some is Peter, James, and John. In the transfiguration, but they see what others will see. Yeah,
indeed, in the anticipation of it. Wow, gosh, there's some big questions here, aren't there? Fantastic. Oh, well, James, thank you very much for the conversation. Friends, thank you for joining us. I hope there's been some useful stuff there. Again, do make comments in the underneath. James, there's 3 other things that people need to do. We didn't remind them at the beginning.
Oh, yes, we've forgotten. Please do like the videos. Click the like button. Do subscribe to the channel, and do comment on the channel or on the social media.
And share. That's right. If you click to share, then you
can and share
and pass that on. So that's great. So, James, thank you very much. See you next week. Friends, do join us again, and we look forward to seeing you soon.